riots, increasing social tensions, radicalisation and social unrest. What is the link between the Australian education system and such phenomena? Why does it matter if we don't understand the Muslim communities living amongst us in Australian society? How can we help counteract intolerance, Islamophobia and bigotry in our education system? Why should we not be surprised from an educational perspective if we witness more future race riots in Australia? Recent research has helped explain why Australian society has experienced harmful events which threaten its social cohesion, multiculturalism and social harmony. In fact, as we will soon see, there is a direct link between what is happening in the Australian education system and broader community, which is contributing to the alienation, marginalisation and radicalisation of individuals. We will see how the relative exclusion of the Australian Muslim identity in the Australian national curriculum helps to fuel ongoing Islamophobia, violence and even radicalisation within our very backyard. But first, let's explain the concept of curricular justice, which forms the basis of this discussion. Curricular justice can be defined as treating pupils in school systems justly in order to improve the quality of education for all in the education system. This implies that in order for curricular justice in the Australian education system to be achieved, the education system must actively update its curriculums to reflect Australia's diversity and promote social harmony through a greater understanding of others. From a curricular justice perspective, the Australian curriculum has failed to achieve just outcomes where the Australian Muslim community is concerned. In fact, the role education can play in reducing misconceptions and increasing cross-cultural understanding for this diverse group was acknowledged more than a decade ago by the Australian Human Rights Commission, or HRIOC, in 2003. There has also been significant research stating why it is essential for school curriculums to incorporate the Muslim experience of racism in the same way as they have incorporated discussion of other forms of racism, considering that Australian Muslims are currently the most marginalised community group in Australia. This then leads us to the next question. Aren't we already achieving cross-cultural understanding through hosting Multicultural Day and Harmony Day within our schools? The answer is that while these events are wonderful for celebrating multiculturalism in Australia, they unfortunately do not essentially counteract misconceptions about minority groups. We can take this idea further by looking at two of the most important subjects in the Australian curriculum that are responsible for teaching us about who we are in relation to others: English and history. This leads to the crucial question: how does the new Australian curriculum for both English and history currently allow mainstream Australian society to learn about Muslim Australians living amongst them? Let's review the key changes and some existing strategies in these curriculums in the following table to make it easier both to praise the strategies used in these subjects and to assess them. In Strategy A, you can see that there are some interesting new studies that enable teachers to educate students about refugees in Australia. For example, the Australian Curriculum History syllabus includes the option to study the experiences of Afghan and Iraqi refugees on their journey to Australia and their treatment by the Australian media upon arriving in Australia. This is a wonderful inclusion that allows students to develop their critical thinking skills and empathise with refugees' experiences. Then we have the generalised course study in the new Australian curriculum, which briefly covers post-World War II migrations, impact on Australia's population growth due to the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and the war in Afghanistan, which is a positive inclusion. As a significant step forward, Strategy C shows that the Australian curriculum English syllabus includes a few recommended texts for Stage 5 which convey Muslim biculturalism, such as Tea with Arwa by Arwa El Masri, and historical insight, such as Where the Streets Had a Name by Randa Abdul Fattah. The new National English K-10 syllabus in Strategy D gives teachers the responsibility of selecting texts appropriate for the needs, interests, and abilities of their students, meaning that some teachers may actually select the above text mentioned. We also have studies on key Muslim personalities. For example, the personality study of key Muslim revolutionary figure Ayatollah Khomeini in the Modern History Stage 6 syllabus, Strategy E, which looks at his character in the context of key personalities in history. At the bottom of this table, in the final strategy to be reviewed today, Strategy F, we see that the History K-10 syllabus also offers teachers a teaching option in Stage 4, the Ancient World, Depth Study Number 4, the Western World and Islamic World, that focuses on the Ottoman Empire. Now let's assess the effectiveness of these strategies, shall we? The problem with Strategy A is that this study is optional and not compulsory, as it competes with the option of studying the experiences of Vietnamese refugees in Topic 5, Migration Experiences, which then competes with another two options called the Environmental Movement and Popular Culture. These are all found in the Depth Study 5 called the Globalizing World. So why is this problematic? I mean, as an educator, I'm a firm believer in giving teachers the flexibility and power to choose what they teach, right? So why does it matter that such a study is not compulsory? The real problem here is that through making such studies, which themselves are limited in scope, optional, we are also leaving the outcomes of social harmony and social cohesion to chance. Let's now look at the topic Migration Experiences in Strategy B. This is a brief study which focuses more on numbers and does not require any in-depth teaching about Muslim migrants who have composed the largest community of dispossessed migrants in the last century. So, by the end of this study, students will still know very little about the Muslim migrants living amongst them. Now, the problem with Strategy C is that teachers have dozens of texts to choose from, giving them flexibility, but increasing their chances of overlooking texts on the Muslim experience due to the numerous options available. If we look at Strategy D, we find that teachers carry the burden of ensuring social harmony in Australian society, a task that is often left to chance because text selection is carried out at the teacher's discretion. Now, this choice can be a problematic one if it means that certain texts which convey the experiences of Australian Muslims are treated as irrelevant. For students living in culturally homogenous communities, such as the Sutherland Shire, even though these students are the most likely to develop unchallenged prejudice towards Muslims or Arabs, too often conflated identities as a result of this gap in their education. If we look at Strategy E, the study of Muslim revolutionary figure Ayatollah Khomeini, it's associated with studying fundamentalism rather than revolutions. We find that by associating Khomeini's character with negative discourse, we ignore a legitimate focus on his revolutionary success in reducing corruption in Iran by overthrowing the Shah, who was a brutal dictator. Associating such personality studies with studies of fundamentalism only serves to obscure the Muslim voice further and the global struggle of the Muslim population against dictatorships, oppression, and imperialism. If we analyse Strategy F, the optional status of studying the Ottoman Empire means that it may never be taught in reality. Even if taught within schools, relying only on the study of Muslims in an ancient context may potentially encourage negative stereotypes such as Muslims being outdated and unable to cope with modern times. It is therefore essential for the wider Australian community to understand the diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds of Australian Muslims in the modern context. Outside of the main curriculums, we have educational websites and programs used by schools to counteract racism, including the Racism No Way website and Making Multicultural Australia website and Cooling Conflicts program. Now, these websites and programs are not compulsory to implement or even consider, being very broad in their scope when targeting the issue of anti-Muslim prejudice. Therefore, we find that the non-compulsory status of learning about Muslim experiences in the English and history curriculums and lack of explicit outcomes render Muslim and Arab voices as invisible, irrelevant, and effectively alien to educators and students in the Australian education system. This is compounded by the fact that existing related outcomes often frame negative discourse on Muslims, Islamic history, and leaders. So, we should not really be surprised, at least from an educational context, that Islamophobia, intolerance, and social tensions are becoming common observations within Australian society. Furthermore, ensuring a positive inclusive portrayal of Arab and Muslim Australians in school textbooks and classroom resources would help to counteract the effects of ongoing media and political attacks on Australian Muslims and Arabs. When educational leadership fails, media often intervene and misinform youth who have limited experiences in dealing with those from different ethno-racial and cultural backgrounds to themselves. Making students more sensitive to Islamophobia in the media, therefore, is a responsibility of educational institutions. Otherwise, Islamophobia and racism are likely to increase. More needs to be done to educate teachers on the importance of considering and selecting texts which deal with the most marginalised groups in society, especially as many Arabic students perceive that racial tension exists within the school environment and that they suffer from poor teacher-student relations as a result. In order to normalise being Muslim, educators need to rely not only on syllabus outcomes to achieve social justice, but also smoothly incorporate content on Australian Muslims into their curricular content in the same way as they do with other cultures and marginalised groups. Unfortunately, the non-compulsory and complementary status of multicultural education and teacher training in Australia is currently a huge obstacle for addressing Islamophobia, as many teachers are unaware of how they are contributing to or impeding social cohesion. Another question arises. Does the need for new resources mean that significant immediate expenditure is needed? Not necessarily. While books can be purchased, text can also be made available online if the need arises. In this technological age, a new text does not necessarily have to be an expensive outlay, as many works can be made available online. In essence, the need to make such simple text compulsory to study rather than voluntary is essential, because social understanding and harmony should not be left to chance. A panel of Muslim teachers may, for example, select the support materials, because they will have both the knowledge of their community's experiences and the professional knowledge of pedagogy and practices to make such crucial decisions and avoid harmful tokenistic representations of Islam. In the end, Parker Jenkins reminds us that good teaching practices, especially building critical thinking skills, are necessary for achieving social justice in education. Furthermore, separating anti-racism strategies from curriculum content leads to cultural racism, such as Islamophobia, making it problematic. Exclusive curriculums ultimately render the Muslim Australian experience as irrelevant and invisible, and serve to ensure that Australian Muslims remain misunderstood, mistreated, and misjudged. A more proactive revision of both curriculums would not only ensure that curricular justice is achieved, but social justice as well. As educators, we do not want to see Australia's multiculturalism undermined by ethnocentric voices, marginalised or radicalised groups, or even an unchallenged media. We can see that since the 2005 Cronulla Riots, which harmed Australia's international multicultural reputation, and now the Reclaim Australia movement, which despite its limited supporters has enjoyed media attention and hysteria, we do have a problem in our ability and willingness to even contemplate Muslim communities living amongst us, let alone accept them. Now, with the Reclaim Australia movement, what we are seeing is more regular race riots. So how can we, as educators and citizens, not be concerned? Ultimately, how can mainstream Australian society tolerate and accept Muslims whom they have been taught are dangerous, unpatriotic terrorists with malign intentions, potentially related to Osama bin Laden? Unfortunately, government policies in education make curricular justice more difficult due to their ambiguity, exclusion of detail, and lack of any real power over the Australian curriculum. Policy analysis also reveals that more proactive intervention is needed, rather than reliance on ambiguous broad policies in order to achieve social justice outcomes. So, what should future revisions of a national curriculum include? For a start, critical literacy, which might include studying texts such as biographies on certain Muslim and Arab personalities, or texts that emphasise the cultural and religious diversity of Australian Muslims. Even visiting Muslim art exhibitions would be a tangible, significant step forward in helping to promote understanding. The widespread lack of knowledge within Australian society and unchallenged, frequent stereotyping of Islam has affected Australian Muslims' participation and equality in Australia. This was established over a decade ago by Riots in 2003. It is important that students comprehend that most mortalities in the last century due to war, oppression, terrorism and economic sanctions have been Muslim, and that most victims of terrorists, such as Wahhabi terrorists, as found in ISIS, Taliban and Daesh, are actually other Muslims and not non-Muslims, as often stated by the media. It is unjust for Muslim and Arabic students in schools to be forced into the role of being a community spokesperson regardless of their maturity level and level of education. It is crucial that these issues are raised when the Australian curriculum is next revised. Ultimately, education has a significant role in educating members of society to understand one another. It is also crucial for deterring not just prejudice, but also social tensions and injustice as well. For more details, please refer to the free article Ensuring Curricular Justice in the New South Wales Education System, published in the International Education Journal Comparative Perspectives in 2014 by Ubani and Ubani. Thank you for listening.